slide, but...
Yeah, and we'll get you to share that in just a moment there.
Sure.
Perfect. All right. Well, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining this week's edition of the COVID-19 Survey Working Group. My name is Eric Kennedy. I'm an assistant professor of disaster and emergency management at York University in Toronto, Canada. I'm excited to have this group together here and have the opportunity to explore different methodological issues related to COVID-19 survey research. This week, I'm excited to be able to take a slightly different perspective on things. We've been talking a lot about opinion-based research and looking at public attitudes around COVID-19. But this week, we're going to dive into a slightly different question around using surveys and other tools to explore people's predictions and forecasts about the future. We'll be joined by Drs. Igor Grossman and Michael Varnum, who will present some of the work of the Forecasting Collective with us. As always, there will be opportunities to ask questions throughout the presentation. You can do that if you're on the Zoom call via the chat, or via YouTube. You can use the chat function there to ask your questions as well. As is tradition, we'll start off the meeting by inviting any of the group members who want to share updates on their research to do so. In this case, I believe we have one person this week, which is Daniela, to share some polar research in the context of COVID-19. Daniela, would you like to share with the group, please?
Thanks, Eric, and lovely to see everyone. I'll try to just bring up the one slide that I have, but unfortunately, it doesn't give me the option to show a PowerPoint. I don't know whether that's from your end, or I have it loaded and I'm not doing that for the first time, but if not, I'll just talk to it.
I think you should have permissions to share your screen there.
Yep, I do, but yeah. Hang on.
How odd.
I'll just go to desktop and see whether that would do it. Let me see. Can you?
Yes, that looks good.
Yep. Okay. So let's do that. So you should see a little slide here that summarizes our COVID-19 project that focuses on Antarctic research primarily and human engagement in the Antarctic region. And just briefly, we do have 5 different work packages that look at different aspects of Antarctic issues in relation to COVID. One focuses on futures, which is probably quite relevant to what Igor and Michael are going to talk about today. The other one focuses on governance and research impact. Then we have one on tourism, one on public perceptions, and one on the impact of COVID on wildlife in the Antarctic. So the 2 of relevance to this group are probably the ones on tourism and governance and research, which both involve surveys. We've just launched the first one that looks at the impact on the research community of COVID-19 and is being hosted by the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, which is an organization of the International Council for Science. So in that survey, we've got 45 questions that cover all aspects. Aside from demographics, I also focus on mental well-being, the impact of COVID on the Antarctic work of the researchers, off ice and on the ice, because obviously we don't have many field seasons coming up for obvious reasons, and also the impact on work in general. And in it, when we are seeing a few responses coming in, and it actually highlights the whole issue with regard to inequalities, not just with regard to the impact of COVID, but generally in the research landscape, which is quite interesting. But a few questions for you are, how do you increase the number of people participating in surveys? And we've launched the survey through social media, through various networks, listservs, and through the various newsletters affiliated with polar research initiatives and groups around the world. But at the moment, it's still relatively slow going. And we realize that a lot of people will have been invited to contribute to lots of surveys. So there might be a bit of survey fatigue. But if anyone has any good suggestions, we'd love to hear that. Obviously, our pool of respondents is relatively small and confined as well, but we'd still hope for about 500 contributions to the survey. And at the moment, we're sitting at about 80. So, yep, thank you. And anyone who's got any interest in polar research, and please feel free to contact us or anyone who's interested in spreading the word about the survey, let us know. Thank you. I'll stop the screen share.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. I'm happy to share those materials on the working group website if you're interested, in some contact information there as well for group members to reach out to Daniela if interested in connecting, or if you have recommendations. Thanks so much for the update. And as always, if you would like to share in an upcoming session, just let me know, either via email ahead of time or via the chat function here on the Zoom call. If you're joining on YouTube, you can learn more at the posted link about the working group and find ways to sign up to become a member and get access to these Zoom sessions. With that, I now want to turn our attention to our special guest this week. Dr. Igor Grossman and Michael Barnum are joining in from the University of Waterloo and Arizona State University, respectively. As mentioned, they're doing work to try to understand forecasting and prediction around the future of COVID-19. And so in this session, we'll be hearing about some of the methods that they use to do that, as well as these sort of very different theoretical angles of looking at the COVID-19 questions. I'll pass the presentation off to them, but as always, please post your questions into the chat, and we will try to feed them into the conversation as we move through the session together. Igor, Michael, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Eric. Thank you so much for having us. So I hope you guys can see. No, this is the wrong screen that you see. Hold on a second. You don't see anything yet, but now you should be able to. Okay.
Yes, that's perfect.
Can you see this? Excellent. Well, thank you so much for having us on your wonderful consortium group this week. I hope what we will have to say, or I will mostly talk, and then Michael will correct me whenever I say something stupid. I hope it will be of benefit for you, and we also would benefit from your feedback because this is an ongoing initiative, and we are still recruiting people to join us in this adventure. This is a very welcoming, collaborative environment. The name of the initiative has collaborative in the title. So I hope we can convince some of you that this is a worthwhile thing to do. So let me first start with a little preamble of what this project is about. When we talk about forecasting, we ask impossible questions. As I was told by a friend from Germany yesterday, whom I interviewed for a forecasting related project, these are horrible questions. What are you asking me to do? Forecasting is hard, and unless you are Harry Seldon from the Foundation novel, Asimov's famous book, you probably will not be able to do it very well. However, as scientists, we know that predictions and forecasting can be one way to probe our theories. Predictions and evaluation of predictions is the hallmark of science. It allows us to test what is right and what is wrong compared against real data. It can also help us to develop certain skepticism towards our own theories, some certain sense of humility, which is often important. And at the same time, of course, in the context of COVID, many people, including scientists, are just wondering, what are the possible consequences? What are the things that may be happening in the future, in the months and years to come? And so this was one of the motivation for me and for Michael, and I brought a few other people on board to really start dealing with this question. Michael and I have been working on tracking and evaluating societal change for quite a number of years, using methods from psychology, from economics, and other related disciplines, using large-scale data sets, big data approaches, to really evaluate how societies evolve, not just through hand-waving, but using actual data. And with the COVID, we had an opportunity to possibly scale this up and also bring in other researchers into the appreciation of possible forecasting. So here a little bit about the collaboration. When I had this idea, I right away phoned Michael, and he, being a fan of the Foundation novel, right away joined me. But we also brought a few other folks on board, both from Canada and from the United States. One of my postdocs, as well as a good friend, Phil Tetlock, who has been doing forecasting research for a number of years. Oh, so the chief question for this project, and let me move this maybe over here so it doesn't really disturb your view, is what do scientists think about the societal changes in the months to come? How accurate are social scientists in their forecasts? How do different scientific approaches to make predictions vary in the type of forecasts that they generate and in their accuracy? And specifically here, we're talking about differences between theory-driven approaches where you use existing social, psychological, behavioral, and other type of theories, or crude data approaches as common in computer science, where you just crunch the numbers, use machine learning or some other approaches, or agent-based modeling, complex systems approaches to develop certain forecasts, or maybe a hybrid of those two. So which of them will be better? Generally, how good are we? And then in terms of the type of project, so we have a number of things going on right now. It's not just one single thing. What I will focus on today is the forecasting tournament that we are currently running. It is an initiative that we started in April, and it will continue at least for a year and potentially even in the following year, given that the COVID will unlikely to be over in the extent of the economic, social, and health consequences, unfortunately, within the next 6 months. But we also have a large-scale forecasting survey of social scientists, data from whom we collected in April and May, a retrospective surveys of social scientists, data from whom we'll be collecting in the next week, and compare prospective and retrospective. And one aspect of our initiative is also to compare scientific and lay forecasts. So we are really interested in, like, are scientists actually any better in their forecasting abilities than the lay public? Now, in this presentation, I'll just very briefly want to focus on the tournament because Eric mentioned that this may be of greatest interest to you guys. And so let me tell you a little bit about the stages here. We started in April and completed the first stage in June, in very early June, where we presented people, scientists from all over the world with data, monthly data, and asked them to generate forecasts for the next 12 months. In about 3 weeks, right after the US election, participants will be given the opportunity to update their forecasts if they want to do so, receiving actual data for the last 6 months and comparing the initial 6 months of forecasts against this actual data. At this stage, we plan to recruit more participants. So in case you're interested in joining this initiative and be some of the forecasters in our tournament, you're very welcome to join us. Please share the word. And then in May of the next year, we'll be concluding our first tournament and probably starting the second tournament of the second year, where we will be comparing then the first 12 months against the available data at that point. So at this moment, you may be wondering, what exactly are we asking people to forecast? And here, in contrast to the wide range of predictions that are specifically concerning the COVID-19, the mortality or the number of cases, or potentially the economic consequences, we wanted to focus squarely on the social dimensions, social psychology, political issues. So this includes things related to emotional well-being and life satisfaction. This includes politics, political polarization, and ideological preferences. And it includes a wide range of issues concerning attitudes and biases towards racial and gender inequality related issues. And now you may wonder, why did we decide to focus on those? They all sound great, of course, but there are many other dimensions that we may want to focus on. And the main reason why we decided to focus on these dimensions and not others is because that's the data that was available. Now, Eric, I see that there is, I think, some comments, but I cannot really reach them. because if I try to get to the sharing, it asks me to stop share to
not to worry. Go ahead and finish your
Okay,
presentation.
sounds good.
Just go through it as desired, and then I'll ask the questions and try to clump them together in themes.
Terrific. Excellent. All right. I was just worried that I may be missing something. Okay, so we provided people with 39 months of past data. So, and that's one of the reasons why we focus on these domains, because those were the domains for which we could get monthly data for the last 3 years, which would be at least the minimum needed in order to build data-driven models if researchers were interested to do so. And so a little bit more about each domain. For affective well-being, life satisfaction, we use Twitter data and calculated indices using some approximations with machine learning. It actually works really well on the national level. This is all for the US. Like, we had to restrict ourselves, unfortunately, once again. So we couldn't do it on the global scale. Of course, we had to at least restrict it to one country. Otherwise, it would be probably possible to make forecasts, even though we would consider a possibility of doing similar forecasting tournaments in other countries, of course. So a little bit of machine learning magic, but it's really not that complicated. The tweets, sentiments, the affective sentiments were matched and approximating then the life satisfaction scores that you would normally get on classic scales. For politics, we looked at ideological preferences and political polarization using the surveys that are routinely conducted by various pollsters. Some of them you can get from the 538 website or from the Gallup for political polarization. And fortunately, again, that data is available on a monthly or even semi-weekly basis for ideological preferences. And for political polarization, specifically presidential approval ratings by party identification. So like the difference score would indicate a degree of political polarization. There are better measures, by the way, for political polarization. I just want to mention that. Of those of you who know a little bit about political science and political psychology, unfortunately, they are not available on a monthly level for the last 3 years in a systematic fashion. Gallup has been shifting in their preferences what they want to assess here, and therefore we couldn't rely on some other possible markers, including affective polarization. For biased attitudes, here we were interested in the both explicit and implicit biases. And explicit biases you can assess using simple attitude questions. About how much you like somebody or dislike somebody using feeling thermometers, which is basically a question about how do you feel towards a certain group, and then compare it to the baseline group. In this case, it's very often the majority population. For implicit attitude scores in social psychology, we often use the so-called implicit association test. It's not perfect, and there are questions about what exactly it is measuring, but it seems to be getting at people's implicit sort of association between certain terms. And on the national level, this type of data has been collected pretty much weekly by volunteers who participate in the project Implicit. This is the largest limitation of this data set of data, because it's not representative. It's very large, it's very rich, there are tens of thousands of participants every week. Nevertheless, they are biased. So what we had to do in order to correct for the bias in representation is apply a particular process that some of you who know a little bit about survey methods may be familiar with. Namely, it's a ranking procedure that allows you to adjust the estimates based on the demographic characteristics of a sample. And this is the one that has been developed by various groups, including Krosnick, using for the ANS survey. Some of you may be familiar with that one, where we essentially weight scores based on their representatives in the population in the United States in that particular month, in that particular year. And if you're interested more, you can, of course, look at this reference. But the idea is that we would take data for age, political affiliation, and race or ethnicity for respective years. And we would adjust our scores within those years that we provide to participants based on those characteristics, depending on which group they are from. And this is exactly the scores that we took, the age, race, political affiliation. That provides a more accurate estimates, and we cross-validated it actually when we looked at some of the explicit attitude items that were collected on a yearly basis. So that helps us to get a slightly better representation of data for the project implicit. For others, of course, the polls are nationally representative, and Twitter, well, it's a Twitter data, it has advantages and disadvantages. So this is what this project is about, a little bit about where we are right now. We, in phase one, got 86 teams who participate from all over the world, who cumulatively made 361 predictions across at least one of the domains, and various team sizes. Half of them are from North America, but fortunately we also have a lot of people from other parts of the world who also are part of this global initiative. And not a surprise, given our affiliation being psychologists, the majority of this is coming from psychology, but also from computer science and economics, which are fields that are often involved in forecasting. And that's all I have to say at this point. If you're interested more, you could go to the website predictions.uwaterloo.ca, or you can email me, or you can find me on Twitter. And I'm hoping that I can convince some of you to join.
Thanks so much, Igor. I appreciate that introduction. What I'll try to do now is to ask some questions to sort of unpack a bit more about the project. We've already got a couple of good ones coming in via the chat, and I'll try to string them together in a thematic order that makes some sense here. So can you take us back towards the beginning of the project and tell us a little bit about the way that you conceptualize the aspects that you wanted people to predict on? So data availability obviously was a huge part, but how did you sort of prioritize what you wanted them to predict on and what kinds of predictions you wanted them to make?
Well, I mean, the main issue was to find topics within the social sciences that would not be just economics or health, and where data would be available. And it sounds, like very broad, but given the data availability, it really constrains you significantly because even mental health related markers, you don't have mental health related markers collected systematically in North America or anywhere else for that matter on a monthly basis. And there is no guarantee. For instance, just to give you a concrete example, Gallup used to collect data on well-being in the past. And then they stopped because they didn't find a funder. And of course, they started again after the COVID started. But in the meantime, there was a gap of at least a year where there was no data, or there would be one data point, and that would not be acceptable. So a lot of things right away were kicked out, which we would have wanted to test. We wanted to have something about well-being. We wanted to have something about politics, both because it's accessible, but also because it's so current right now in North America and with the election coming up. We were initially not that excited about racial stuff, in part because this was before George Floyd. When we were coming up with this, we were thinking surely the least interesting thing would be something related to attitude towards the minorities in North America. Maybe Asian American minorities, yes, but African American minority, probably not. And yet, of course, everything changed, and June happened, and we had protests all over the world, including in Canada, in Europe, and we were fortunate enough to have collected that data because it was available, but we did collect it, first of all, because it was available, not because we had a particular interest. So that's where the logic is coming from. It's really mostly constrained by the data available.
Right, and I would say to some extent too, at least for most of those variables, there was at least some theory in the social sciences plausibly linking these things to levels of infectious disease.
Yeah.
So, for most of those variables, there was some reason to suspect a relationship might be there. We didn't just sort of randomly pull things out of a hat that we thought should have no relationship. So that might have been interesting too, to have as a control, something that we would have, maybe in retrospect, if we could have come up with some kind of time series that we thought, no way that this should be affected. But
that's right. So one big thing that is important here, and thank you, Michael, for reminding me, is that in social sciences, especially in social psychology, there's a range of theories that Michael and I worked on some of that, but also some of our colleagues on the role of infectious diseases for subsequent social psychology, that people become more conservative when diseases are happening or becoming more, pathogens becoming more widespread. The gender equality goes down, that people become a little bit more racist and things like that. So there's a whole range of theories. And within those theories, you can identify certain variables that would be potentially more interesting than others. And one of the motivations for this project initially was also to provide almost like a test naturalistic experiment of those theories against the real data in the context of the current crisis.
Thanks for that. So at a really practical level, I sign up and I say I want to be one of your forecasters. Can you walk us through a little bit of how you actually gather these predictions from people? What are the steps that the teams participate in? How do they share in their predictions? What's that kind of format and logistical element like?
Right. So the first thing you do is you'll go to the website, you leave your information, your email, and then we'll contact you in 2 weeks when we start the recruitment for the second phase. You should do it, Eric. Basically, the idea is that on the website we'll have data sets available, which will include data for the last 3 years. As well as the additional 6 months now, the 6-month phase. You can use that data, or you can use just your theoretical judgment or your intuition to make exact predictions for what would be the data points for the subsequent 6 months. You write them down in an Excel file and you upload it in the respective location on the website. At the same time, you'll fill out a brief survey in which we ask you, well, how did you come about making this forecast? Did you use intuition? Did you use some statistical models? Did you use some theory? And as well as certain questions about, what are potential conditional variables that you think your forecast will depend on? Is it, you think like, some people actually said like, there's nothing that can change this. It doesn't matter. It's very fatalistic, sort of COVID doesn't matter for this domain. And, things like implicit attitudes, there is a case that can be made that for implicit attitudes, short-term shifts, even on the dramatic scale, may not necessarily be quick enough to really impact the change. So we ask those questions, you fill out the questionnaire, and that's it.
So it's very heavily quantitative data at the level of the monthly predictions for each of these attributes. So a numeric value for as many of them as you want to do.
That's right. You provide numeric value because we want to have exact time point forecasts where you think it will be in let's say in December, January, and so on. By the way, the website is predictions.uwaterloo.ca, but I will also share the presentation and the slides, and hopefully we can link it with to the video. I will send Erica, maybe I can send it to you.
Absolutely. Okay, so you get all of this quantitative data in from these spreadsheets, and presumably some are individuals, some are teams. Right. Can you walk us through your plan in terms of assessing accuracy? How are you doing that analysis of who's getting these predictions right and wrong? And I think that will bring us to an interesting question in the chat about margins of error in a moment. But before we get to that, how are you assessing rightness and wrongness in predictions?
Right, so that's something that we cannot, of course, do at this moment, especially for predictions that will be for, let's say, April of next year. So we have to wait. But the general principle, and we can already do that for this last 6 months, for the phase 1, is to get the data for the actual monthly events, because we know that hopefully, Twitter will continue to be collected in the next 6 months. The pollsters, unless something dramatic, civil war-like will happen in the U.S. after the election, will probably continue collecting continue polling American populace on the attitudes and towards the president, as well as which political affiliation people belong to. And Project Implicit is also likely to continue. So we'll get that data. So then we have the estimates against the actual against the predictions, and the next step is to use standard approaches that are used in econometrics and in the disciplines that use forecasting, including mean squared error, but there are also some other more sophisticated approaches that would allow us to estimate the degree, the margin of error across time for each of the domains and across domains. So that will be one of the approaches. We have several procedures that we pre-registered that we will be using for evaluating the accuracy. There is no single one. There is quite a debate even in the forecasting community what would be the most appropriate prediction, but way to evaluate predictions. But yeah, so there are several statistical methods for doing that.
So I think that brings us to a really interesting point raised by Jean-Francois around margins of error in prediction, right? So when we're talking about prediction, we're talking both about perhaps the central value, but also about confidence intervals, right? How likely you think something is to happen. To use the 538 example that you brought up earlier, I mean, they have been quite forward about pointing out, for instance, in 2016, that a Trump election was part of the scenarios that they forecasted, and indeed was forecasted as slightly more likely, even if an off chance by them.
Yep.
So how do you deal with this element of the range of confidence in people's predictions and margins of error?
Right, so that's an excellent question. There are several ways to do that, and of course, each of them will address somewhat different aspects of this. First of all, when you get a large enough sample, and in our case, we're kind of approximating that, 86 teams is already substantial, but of course, we are aiming for much, much more in the second phase. You can evaluate, for instance, the mean level prediction, and then the confidence interval around the mean across the scientific community or across people who use a similar type of approach, be data-driven or theory-driven. So that's number one. The second one is we do ask in the survey how confident people are in their predictions. And so we can evaluate the degree of confidence. Now, we can't really say, we don't really ask people, what is your 95% confidence interval? Because it would be very tempting to make it very large. And it's not really it's also very hard to evaluate that sometimes, especially if you are not well versed in what exactly particular data points mean. So that's why we ask on a scale just from 1 to 7, how confident are you in your prediction here? And I guess then we can also evaluate it across different domains. And so that's also something that we will be doing, if people are systematically wrong or systematically right. And finally, we do ask about the conditionals. So one of the things that, for instance, Phil Tatlock and I talked about is that it's not only interesting to know whether people are right or wrong just by themselves, but also whether they are potentially wrong for right reasons. That is, for instance, if they're conditional, if they believe that there is a certain conditional factor on which their forecast depends, and this conditional factor just happens to go in opposite direction, but like theoretically the model may potentially still be right. So we do consider, for instance, the COVID cases, and if people have a particular forecast for the COVID cases, and maybe their COVID cases prediction is wrong, and if you adjust for that, they will get to the right estimate. So that's another level of getting at potential uncertainty and sort of like dependency in their forecasts.
Really interesting stuff around the contingency there. Jean-Francois, did you want to follow up at all on that question and ask anything more?
Yeah, well, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yeah, so I quite understand the rationale of well, first of all, that's very, very interesting. And I understand the logic of the root mean square error to see who's and who's not overall accurate. But what if, I'll give you a concrete example. I'm from political science, and I have one and only one prediction is that political ideology movement will be zero, no movement at all. That's my only prediction. So the root mean square error for the other item would not be that useful. And let's say that the movement is of -2 percentage points. Am I accurate or not based on your model? And what about other teams, for example?
Yeah. So the way, I get what you're saying. So the way to approach this, and I think that's partially what you're getting at, is if there was some kind of a very basic, very crude model that would say no change, or just like some kind of a linear thing, how much better are you than that model? Yeah, this is one of the common approaches that forecasting community uses. They would use approaches such as the MACE approach that Rob Hintman developed. And we are planning to include those. So we will be evaluating it against sort of like let's call them primitive benchmark comparisons, like no change or just a linear change, or just stuff like that. So yeah, absolutely. It's very important to do so.
Fascinating. Thank you. So much to tackle here. And so I want to talk a little bit about this qualitative data that you're collecting alongside. Right. And then perhaps we can turn our eyes a little bit to the people that you have involved in this. But let's talk about that qualitative data for the moment. So you had mentioned that you were collecting information like their rationales on why they were making particular predictions and their explanations. Can you just sort of walk us through the kinds of things you're asking and the kinds of data you're getting from that survey portion?
Right. Yeah. So there are several things that we were interested in. And of course, one thing I would like to point out is that when you deal with academics who are super busy, especially over the course of the COVID, you just can't ask that much, especially if you want them to participate in more than one domain, and for each of them you would be asking them 20 questions. So there is a certain trade-off going on, how much we could have asked. But so what did we ask? We asked them about how they built their model. What is going into their model? Is it theory-driven? Is it data-driven? Or a combination of the two, which we then later used this qualitative data to quantify, to sort them into different groups. We asked about the conditionals, not just the COVID cases or death, but also other conditionals, so that we can see if if their forecast is rather simplistic, simple regression, maybe with one predictor in addition to this one, or fairly complex, and what are the type of conditionals that they consider. Then the other thing that we were interested in, and this was inspired by some of the other work in geopolitics and forecasting tournaments there, are the counterfactual narratives. What do people use to say, if only this would not have happened, then we would have a completely different scenario here. And often it's not only interesting to know those in their own right, which it is, but also because they would reveal a certain underlying idea about where the person is coming from in terms of their ideology. For instance, if only, and this is something that occurred in this data, if only Trump would have reacted differently, or if only we would have closed borders right away, or if only China would have right away said where they're at and that they have a huge problem and communicated with the public. And so this type of ideas, like, if only you would have done that, then how does it impact the forecast? So we're also evaluating that. So those are the three that we have. So the conditionals, the models, and the counterfactuals.
Really interesting. I mean, this makes me wonder a lot about how you evaluate the accuracy of more qualitative predictions, right? In some ways, you've given yourself a really nice project here by relying on these very quantitative predictions about tell us what the level of this value will be. But are there techniques that are available? Are there methods that are available for reliably evaluating those kinds of more qualitative or contingent or explanation-based predictions?
Well, yeah, no, I don't know. I don't think so. I mean, I mean, the counterfactuals, of course, not. But for the conditionals, we could certainly evaluate conditionals, some of the conditionals quantitatively. Michael and I thought very hard, for instance, whether we could include other conditionals and ask people to quantify them in addition to COVID. At the end, we gave up because it would also rely on us, depend on us be able to obtain reliable data for these conditionals on a monthly basis, which is, again, not a given. For instance, imagine somebody says, it will depend on the number of unemployed in the country, or some type of stimulus packages, or approval of stimulus packages in Congress, and so on and so forth. And then we are like, well, can we measure that in a timely basis? I mean, unemployment is often delayed by at least a year, that data, if it's available at all. So we would just not be able to do it within the realm of the forecasting tournament. But retrospectively, of course, we could evaluate things like, and maybe even like get later some historians who would then say whether it matters or whether it doesn't matter. Did it matter then if X thing happened or not? And then compare those historic evaluations in hindsight against the predictions of the scientists.
I also wonder, Igor hasn't mentioned this, but there's yet another project that's been spawned by this where, basically we've been interviewing people who are, experts in some way in human behavior or societies, and asking them in more open-ended fashion, what kinds of things do you think will happen, or what should people do to cope? I mean, potentially you could develop coding schemes for those responses as well. But it's a little dicier when you're trying to evaluate, was that accurate? I mean, what's our yardstick, right? What's our thumbs up or thumbs down? It went up, it went down. We need some kind of quantitative data as a ground truth, I think. But I think it's certainly possible to ask these questions in a somewhat less, quant output kind of format. And, we're in fact doing this in some ways too. We've also asked people to make sort of more general predictions. For example, by what percentage do you think this will increase or decrease or stay the same? Will it stay the same? So those are sort of a few angles, if that's helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I ask because I'm really interested in some of the very human dimensions of this, right? So one of the things I think lots about is in terms of the narrative framings that people use. How are we going to think about the causal stories here with COVID, right? How are we going to tell stories about why COVID happened the way it did in 10 years, in 20 years?
Yes.
Think a lot about, right now I'm thinking a lot about how people are constructing themselves narratively vis-a-vis other people in their community. So I will admit that I'm one of the people who feel like I'm hunkering down really well and am beginning to get exacerbated and frustrated at times watching things. And so looking at these predictions about how people tell these stories and situate themselves, but those are really messy things to try to get at in a predictive kind of sense.
Absolutely. I mean, the main reason why I started, well, Michael mentioned that, Eric, certainly this project of that I asked you to also provide some responses, World After COVID, which is more of an outreach activity with world's leading scientists making sort of forecasts about the positive and the negative aspects of the future after the pandemic and what we need to sort of make it to some extent a better place for the humanity. The main reason for that was to create sort of a sense of narratives and almost like a historical document of what we thought of. Because often, as a famous futurist William Gibson once said, thinking about the future or writing about the future or reflecting on the future is one way to understand your concerns of the present. So when I ask, for instance, you, Eric, about what do you think will happen after the pandemic, in some ways it reflects on you and your worries and your narratives in a given moment. And yeah, I'm very worried about this general trend because I just spoke today with an episodic memory researcher, one of the leading figures in that. And one thing that he pointed out to me is like, because the way how we now do everything on Zoom, we don't really have any contextual breaks that would be able to anchor our events in our lives. Everything becomes like this mush in our memory. And I'm really concerned that we may not necessarily have a good memory of what this situation was like during the time of the COVID, because it's just like it all seems the same. You just run the meeting. So normally you have breaks. You get a coffee. You meet with a friend in another place. You go and teach and something like that. And we don't have that anymore. And we don't have that both on the individual level, but I think we also, being so obsessed with the news, don't have it as much in terms of creating some kind of a narrative and understanding what are the narratives that are driving us right now.
Mm-hmm. Really fascinating. Thank you. There's another great question in the chat here about the use of aggregation and synthesis. So there's lots of work done in the prediction world around looking at the wisdom of groups, right? And whether group guesses are better than individual guesses.
Yep.
And lots of work done on synthesis and aggregation. So we've talked about outlets like 538. Can you tell us anything you've found so far in terms of group versus individual phenomenon and ways that you might be exploring this and testing this possibility down the road?
I could tell you some preliminary results, but I would reserve the right not to at this moment yet. And the reason is just because I would love to wait until we have the second phase of the forecasting recruited, and just in the off chance some of our forecasters are listening, or we will be recruiting new forecasters here. I don't want to bias you guys in terms of where differences lie. The margin of error varies depending on, in very abstract terms, I can tell you that margin of error and variability varies depending on the approach that you take, and the different approaches, as expected, appear to be associated with somewhat different margins of error. That's as much as I'm willing to say at this moment, but please give me a month and I will be able to tell you more.
Well, and also I don't think it'll give much away to say one of our benchmark kind of things for evaluating forecasts will be some kind of crowd wisdom aggregation of all the forecasts.
Right.
So we will actually look at that and be able to say something.
That's right.
Fantastic. I'm really, really excited about that. One more question about the forecasting element, and then I want to dive a little bit into who's doing this, your sampling and the participants that you have. One thing that's garnered a lot of public attention lately has been betting markets, right? And quantified predictions in that sense, where people put their money where their mouth is. I'm curious for your reflections on how those work with respect to COVID, how they're aligned or different from what you're doing, and sort of how you situate your work relative to that world.
Okay, so betting markets are set up somewhat differently, in the sense that what is really unique about this initiative here is that the forecasts are not framed in terms of a yes-no probabilities for events, which is what typical prediction markets and betting markets are set up as. Typically, the way it's done in the intelligence community is that you're asked to provide a probability judgment for certain events to happen or not to happen. For instance, in the context of COVID, early prediction market events, I didn't look at most recent one, but early ones were, how likely is it that the Olympic Games will be postponed to 2021? Right? Provide your probability judgment. And if your probability judgment is above a certain percentage point, you may win, or otherwise you may lose. In the current tournament, it's somewhat different, because we are actually asking about time point, specific point predictions. So that's a major difference. Otherwise, in terms of the motivational dynamics, whether winning money or not, yeah, well, here we're dealing with scientists, so I think the same type of dynamic probably wouldn't work anyways. Otherwise, we would not be in science, but somewhere else. I'm certainly not making as much money as I probably could have if I would have gone into business. So there is a little bit of that. But there is, of course, an incentive. So, for instance, all people who will be part of our tournament will have a right, assuming that they are willing to satisfy certain criteria, to be on the resulting mega paper that we will be submitting to one of the so far unnamed journal. But you can think of a few on the very top that we are going for. So there is a bit of an incentive here too, but it's not a conditional incentive as you would get it in the betting markets.
Very cool. We only have a couple of minutes left, and so I want to ask real quickly a couple of questions about the sampling here and who you have participating, and then one last broader question to end our time together. So in terms of the sampling, you mentioned earlier that you are looking, one of the elements you're looking at is the lay versus expert participation. Can you tell us a bit about sort of who you're getting in each group, how you're trying to recruit these folks, and how you're defining each category?
Right. So this is related both to this tournament project as well as several other initiatives. As I mentioned, in April and May, we were asking academics, a large group of academics, over 400 academics, both in April and in May, to make all sorts of social and mental health related forecasts. And we also gathered a group of lay people to do the same in May. For the tournament, so there we're just interested in comparing some kind of more holistic predictions, and surprisingly we found not that many differences between academics and lay people. Tells you a little bit about the status of prediction abilities in social sciences. But for this forecasting tournament, we also towards the end of the first phase, gathered 400 people from Prolific Academic, which is a survey platform that allows you to recruit, if you want, even representative samples from different parts of the world. In this case, we focus specifically on Americans. And we asked them to do a similar type of experience where they would download data or provide some estimates. Of course, they probably would not be spending any time doing data-driven forecasts, and indeed majority of them were just, they would maybe look regression or something like that, but otherwise they would just provide their numbers and that's it. So that's where this idea is coming from. So we are evaluating it in general across different projects, not just this tournament. In this tournament, the lay samples are just people from Prolific Academic who are pretty easy to recruit, and so far the quality of the data is much better than, let's say, the comparisons, Amazon Mechanical Turk, for instance. And for academics, we were advertising, and I literally had to email people and different labs around the world and ask them if they would be interested, or some of the graduate students in the lab would be interested in participating. It's both decision-making researchers, members of the intelligence community, economics, political science, sociology, and of course, psychology.
Fantastic. There's so much I want to ask about the expert side of this. We've got a question from the YouTube chat about how you're defining expertise given the range of disciplines that might be relevant, as well as academic versus experiential knowledge. And I'm curious too about that, because often when we study expertise, we notice the ways that experts are often bad at explicating the positions they hold, that they might be based on tacit knowledge. So I'm curious if you can talk just for 30 seconds here about how you're defining experts and whether you've noticed anything in terms of abilities or lack thereof in explaining.
One of the things that we ask people to do is just indicate whether they base some of their, if some of their research includes the domains that they would be making forecasts about, either in their graduate training, if they're graduate students, let's say in social psychology, political science, or if they have published some papers on this topic. So that's pretty much how we go about, in a very crude manner, defining if you have some kind of credentials where you focus some of your research time on this particular topic. So far, surprisingly, expertise didn't matter that much, to be honest. So that's one thing I can say. Also encourage you all, even if you're not experts, to be part of this initiative. Because apparently, and this goes actually pretty well with work that Phil Tetlock has done on so-called super forecasters. The best forecasters who can, at least in the geopolitical realm, are not those who are necessarily expert in this particular thing that they're forecasting about, but rather those who are open-minded and are willing to accept their ignorance and humility and consider ideologically diverse perspectives.
Well, thank you so much for that. And unfortunately, we're going to need to wrap up the conversation there. I think it's a nice spot to end on in terms of these ideologically diverse perspectives, because I think your presentation today has been so valuable in helping us to show yet another way that we can engage with folks and collect interesting data and collect both qual and quant kinds of information. There were a couple more questions in the chat that we weren't able to get to today about the retrospective project and the like. So I'll follow up with you afterwards and get that information so we can link it on the past presenters portal so that people can find out more. Speaking of that portal online, it always has the updates of the next upcoming sessions. Next Wednesday, we will have Ethan Greenwood from the Wellcome Trust and Patrick Sturgis from the London School of Economics, who will be updating us on the Great Britain Monitor results on COVID-19 and some of the methods used by the Wellcome Trust there. And then we'll be joined on the 28th by Jean-Francois, who's attending today, who has some really interesting work published recently about social desirability bias in the design of COVID-19 questionnaires. And so we're really going to delve into how that can affect your questionnaire design. For now, though, I just want to thank you, Igor and Michael, again for joining us, as well as everyone watching on Zoom and on YouTube. It's a pleasure to have you here. Stay safe this week, and we'll see you again next Wednesday.